Well, following the recreation of the commons, let's hear about the Media Blitzkrieg and what the hell that is. Tell me more.
It is a term that has been made up by a friend of mine. So the idea, it's very much the flooding the zone approach to media that we're seeing at the minute. I think when we were looking at stories for this week, I mentioned before the show, I had like 6 different news articles sent to me this morning that were all absolutely horrifying. We've got the Trump tariff situation that's just like flooded the news with hundreds of charts of various different things, and it's changing constantly. We've also had Trump saying that they're essentially not going to follow the guidance of the Supreme Court when it comes to returning US citizens from El Salvador and referring to them as terrorists, which is a very, very significant marker in terms of, the checks and balances aren't really there anymore. So what does that mean? We've also this morning had an article that the UK Supreme Court is going to define what a woman is, which is going to be a whole new culture war that comes in and kicks off. And then at the same time, we've got shit in our water. Scotland's had wildfires for like a week. There's a lot happening at the minute. So it was difficult to pick like one story to focus on, but I was looking through a few different articles around the kind of weaponizing of chaos and overwhelm that we're seeing, not just in relation to Trump and the US and his kind of actual political strategy of do so many insane things all the time so that people can't respond, but also it feels like our mainstream media is attempting to push people into a state of like analysis paralysis. So yeah, there's a lot of different terms for it. There's like, flooding the zone, there's like overwhelm, there's something that's like distract and divert or something like that, and then also the term that my friend Davey Moo uses, which is media blitzkrieg. So I guess I wanted to talk through that a little bit.
Sounds fantastic.
One of the things that I've seen a lot more of recently is, especially on social media, a lot of creators trying to take a bit of a step back from covering every news story. Obviously the mainstream news cycle is 24 hours. There's constantly new things coming out. There are a number of like social media creators on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube Shorts that will do like headlines constantly. And myself and a few people who I speak to quite a lot used to do a lot more of these like timely articles and coverage talking about like recent things that have been reported. And almost everyone who I speak to has had to strip that down and really prioritize what they're speaking about, partly for themselves, for their own kind of ability to continue speaking on issues and not just completely burn themselves out and become useless, but also for our audiences. Because I've found recently that whenever you talk about something terrible that's happened, if you don't have an action for someone to take at the end of it, you just get hundreds of people saying, God, this is awful. And a lot of people are very scared right now. There's a lot of people who are being targeted more publicly, more blatantly than they used to. And it's very, very easy for people to just sort of fall into this sense of ruminating and being completely unable to take any kind of action. So I wanted to sort of ask you guys as well, in terms of your own media hygiene. Obviously, we're all talking about politics quite a lot of the time. We're all talking about media. I found that finding that going to like specific independent news sources for specific issues is really important, or even on social media, following specific creators who talk about a specific issue and using them as like more of a voice for things that I care about has helped. I've also found that trying to limit how frequently I check the headlines has been helpful. So just getting like all of the shit out the way at the beginning of the day, focusing in on a couple of things that I might be able to help on. But I've also found that focusing on smaller scale issues where you feel like you can make an impact, for example, like you said, Debs, with the boycotting the water bills, or with supporting groups like Youth Demand, who were dealing with that horrendous treatment by the police last week, and actually still are. People getting things confiscated constantly. They're being kind of terrorized by the police at this point. Yeah, trying to kind of hone in on smaller issues that you feel like you can actually make some kind of movement on has been helpful. But I wanted to ask you guys as well, what are you doing to build resilience in yourselves, to manage your media hygiene, to avoid the blitzkrieg?
Chivers, how do you respond to the analysis paralysis?
I sort of don't, which is really worrying. I think thinking through like what is my actual daily media consumption, it's far too much and far too it's like background noise, constantly ongoing. So I think I'm definitely like one of these people that needs to find an alternative to it. I did a sort of talk for some sixth form students the other week on like the history of media and what the media is and how it works. And I made the point in there, which of course was completely alien to them, that even as recently as 15 years ago, or maybe 20 years ago, the news was something that happened once a day, right? You had the newspapers that came out in the morning with their headlines and their stories for the day. You had the 6 o'clock news. You maybe had some radio bulletins that were just repeating whatever had happened in the newspapers or on the bulletins. And then that was it. And you didn't get any more news until the next day. And it was the job of journalists to kind of scurry around and decide what's the most important thing, what's the priority, what do I need to talk about? And obviously we know that like all of the systemic biases and structural failings of the media meant that what they chose to talk about and how they chose to talk about it was shit and bad. But in the basic sort of at the level of consumption, like how we as citizens were engaged with the media, it was a much more hands-off, separate approach, which obviously had different power dynamics to it because it was something that was done to you rather than something you were involved in. But on like a basic psychological and emotional level, it was probably a lot healthier, right? Because unless you were unfortunately one of the many marginalized groups that were constantly being defamed and traduced and brutalized in the media, sort of it was something that was just there on the side rather than as it is now, something that is literally part of your interactions every sort of 30 seconds, 2 minutes, however often you check your phone, which clearly for me is too much. How to get around it, I think, is obviously cutting back, recognizing that when Trump is making statements about tariffs, they're not going to be any different in 30 seconds time or 5 minutes time or even in a week's time. This idea of like media blitzkrieg is really interesting because I think the media have definitely jumped, and I mean the media in like an institutional sense, like the profession of journalism has loved latching onto the minute by minute changes in stories without ever seeking to provide explanation, justification, context, reasoning, taking even one step back on a story. So I think there's an element there in, like, as you were saying, checking the news once, stepping away. And if you want to think about it, just like thinking through yourself of like, what does this story mean for me? Why is it important? Why do I think the media have picked up on this story and how it's being reported? And then in 6 hours' time or 12 hours' time or the next day, then coming back and saying, well, how has it evolved? And often you'll find that like if you did like a comparative experiment of someone who's following the news every 30 seconds and someone who's following the news once a day, they'll probably come out with the same pieces of information, but the person who's been following it every 30 seconds is like Tweak from South Park, where they're just constantly shaking and juddering and go, oh my god, the world's about to blow up, everything's shit, we're all gonna die, and then nothing has really changed afterwards. Yeah, it's a lot of sort of, I don't want to say personal responsibility, but like personal choice, personal like self-care of just recognizing that this horrible little device in your hands is not benefiting you, and you're sort of helping to shore up the laziness of modern journalists, where they're like, well, my job isn't to go out and discover and interrogate facts and provide context and explanation. My job is to just say, breaking, Trump said another thing. Breaking, he said the opposite. And like there's barely 2 seconds between the two statements. So yeah, this is a challenge to me and lots of other people. Read less news, but do more with the news that you're reading in your own mind and like think about it more and be more critical on it.
I was just gonna, yeah, that's absolutely fantastic. I think that idea of like drill into the stories that you can act on or you can do something about, but also like I think it's very easy for people to go like it's always been a sort of privileged. A lot of people will say like you've got the privilege to switch off. Some people have the privilege to switch off. Like I could make my life very easy by not caring about politics and going around being a white lady and ignoring it until it eventually comes to bite me, which it will. But it's not just about like self-care or like preservation from that side. Media companies make money off your eyeballs and your attention span. Like the Daily Mail is losing revenue on its print publication. It's making money on its online advertising from people reading stories that outrage them and keep them engaged. It's an easy play for them. On the other side of that, you can't be a successful citizen in terms of activism, in terms of being sustainably engaged in things if you burn yourself out. So I think that's also an important distinction to make, is like don't switch off because you don't care, like don't make it so that you're unbothered about what's happening, but like making sure that I see it more as like slow and steady, keeping yourself engaged but in a more conscious way, which I think you put brilliantly there, Tom.
And I think it partly links through to the broader ideals of media reform, because switching off for the sake of switching off, like you say, is very tempting and it's easier for some people than others. And what I often get when I'm like talking about media reform is people come back and say, well, we don't necessarily need to change the media because you can just stop reading the Daily Mail. You don't have to go to their websites. You don't have to read The Sun. I think, well, that's true on an individual level, but that doesn't stop those outlets from existing. That doesn't stop those outlets from harming the people, from still publishing hundreds of articles a year about, the alien threat from Muslims and immigrants and climate protesters. Like the groups that have always been attacked and harmed by large corporate media will continue to be attacked and harmed by large corporate media, whether you're reading them or not. So it's that distinction between, yes, switching off and stepping back and drilling in deeper, and particularly like recognizing that the media landscape we have doesn't provide much of an opportunity in itself for us to digest and explore and explain the news. We have to do that ourselves, right? A lot of the responsibility for understanding what's going on in the world has now been deferred onto us. Not that it was ever successfully done by mainstream journalists, but like that's what they say their ideal role is. Like, oh, don't you worry about the news because we're here as professional journalists. We can interpret all the facts.
We're
for
very
you.
balanced.
We're very balanced. We give you
unbiased.
everything you need to know. So don't you worry your pretty little head about reading the news, because as long as you read our paper or read our bulletins, we'll get everything sorted. There's like switching off on like a mental health reason to give yourself a greater critical perspective, but still recognizing that like, and that's part of the reason why I think stepping back and drilling into stories much more is useful from a media reform perspective, because in drilling down to the stories, you start to recognize more of those biases and failures and corporate sort of structural harms that are done by large media corporations, and finding some way to do something about it while also protecting your own basic needs to a useful and not blitzkrieg news environment.
Not to blow my own trumpet, but this conversation is making me feel like I'm very hygienic. Like,
Well.
yeah, I actually really don't look at news headlines. The ways that I engage with news is through email, through some email lists like the Canary or like a couple of local ones. Actually, I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I think so. My engagement with American news is mostly through podcasts from the US, like In Bed with the Right, which I think is really great. The Conspirituality podcast, Hard Fork podcast, like ones which are, they will be talking about a news thing, but they won't be responding to it like in the moment. It might be a week or two after the news event, and they've had a little bit of time to process it, and they are trying to put it a bit more in context. And then when I want to know what's happening in the mainstream media, I will listen to Navarro Live, but I'll listen to it on 1.5 speed and kind of skip over the men.
Viable.
I love it. I listen to everything on 1.5 speed. I think it's the only way. In a similar fashion, I think for the longest time I did the whole thing of like, just don't want to engage with the news, don't want to do it, don't want to do it, don't want to do it. And to be perfectly honest, I think the most I engage with it is when I, listen to you guys talk, and I'm like, wow. So
but I do think
interesting.
this, the whole idea with news clubs is that we're trying to create these collective spaces, and I think that is really, really important. Like the other route for my news is through activist WhatsApp and Signal groups.
Yeah.
And often I will hear about a news event from a protest, and I think that's actually, that does feel a lot less shit, because there is an action attached to it. And even if you can't always make it or support the thing, sometimes you're like, oh, I can give them some money, or yeah, I can pass this on to some other people, or something which makes you feel a bit less like, yeah, it's just a thing that is happening to you. I think there's something interesting culturally happening. I don't know how much you guys feel this as well, but I've definitely noticed that it seems much less socially acceptable, and I think for good reason, to just start a conversation with like, oh my God, did you hear about this terrible thing that's happened? Feels like there is a bit more of a culture of checking in, of like, how engaged are you feeling able to be right now? And I think that's a good practice. And at the same time, I do think it's important for us to find each other at those moments when we are really feeling really activated, or feeling like, yeah, I need to not be alone with this. I need to not be sitting here scrolling on my phone and sort of in some ways feeling connected to this wider world, and in other ways feeling like as isolated as it could be. So yeah, I guess this is the whole idea with news clubs, of like how to create a space where people have all agreed and consented that right now we're going to talk about the news, but we're also going to be sharing those feelings and trying to find a way to do something a bit more productive with them than like just screaming in our bedrooms.
I really like what you said there in terms of almost receiving news from the people around you. Like, not actually because you've seen the big headline, but because someone has said to you, this is actually valuable and we can actually do something about that. I think to me, that's what this podcast is in many ways. It's like, oh wow, like now I can shout at all my English friends and tell them to like go not pay their water bill, right? Because it means I'm necessarily like in communication and in community with someone somewhere at some point. It transforms how I'm relating to the news. And I like it because I don't like the news. I love listening to you guys.
I think it's also, it's like, it's that point of, I really like what Tom said about step back and kind of lock in on the wider strategy. I think those are the 2 points that are really big for me. One, do it when there's an action. But two, looking at individual news stories all the time is pointless if you're not connecting the dots between what's happening. I punch my microphone. Like, because people will
It's a very
continue to be
powerful point. You
baffled.
needed to punch the microphone.
Listen, because it's like when you have these culture wars coming up, like, oh, we've got a new thing to blame, and we've got a new group to blame, a new marginalized group that we're going to go after and target. If you know about how moral panics work and you know about how folk devils work, then you're not surprised the next time the story comes along. And it's the same tactic again and again. Like, a lot of the strategies that we're seeing from the mainstream media have happened multiple times in the past. Looking at the news not just as individual incidents that are constantly happening, and seeing that wider strategy and how it's impacting you, I think also can help you feel a lot more prepared for it. Though not fully prepared, still quite stressed, but given the circumstances, a little bit more equipped.
So go start your news club and be more intentional about how you listen to news, and have friends and stuff and talk to them.
And don't pay your water bill or your TV license. Fuck it.
I think TV license is a funny one. I feel like I know too many people that don't pay their TV license.
Allegedly.
Let's make that a specific topic.
Yeah, I have a
Another
lot
week.
to say about the TV license. Probably very unpopular things to say about the TV license in our space, but for another day.
Yes, I'm so excited. We'll have a little break moment, as we should have before, and we will come back with Chivers and your brilliant, brilliant story and information around the Birmingham bin strikes, which I know I'm going to find so riveting.
Sassed into the ad break.
Yeah.